Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much indeed for coming. This is the first of three parts of the Keswick Hall Lecture series this year. We're very grateful indeed for the sponsorship of the Keswick Hall, the Keswick Hall Trust. And the idea is over the next 3 weeks we have an opportunity to look at kindness and different aspects of that. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. My name's Marsden. I'm the head of politics, philosophy, language and communication studies here. I'll introduce our guests in just a few moments. As I mentioned, the series goes on for 3 weeks. Next week when you come, if you bring some friends with you and avoid the competing attractions that Norwich is so blessed with, that would be fantastic. Okay. So, being kind in a cruel world. So once upon a time, there's this wise old woman who lived in the mountains, and one day she was out walking. And as she walks, she happens by a stream. She looks down in the stream, she finds a very precious, shiny object, which she retrieves from the river, puts in her bag, and goes home. Short time later, somebody who's climbing the mountains, walking through, happens on where she's living, and knocks on the door, says, "I'm hungry." So she says, "Fine, no problems at all." Goes to a bag, gets out some food, and gives it to the traveller. Traveller happens to spot this precious stone in the bag, and he thinks, "Oh, that looks interesting. Looks pretty valuable." Says, "Can I have that stone you've got in your bag?" He says, "Yeah, of course." So he takes it away, and thinking he's got a really good deal here, because he's appreciated how much value is attached to this precious stone. The old woman thinks nothing of it. A few days later, the traveller returns to the house, brings back the precious stone, and gives it back to the woman, and says, "You were kind enough to give me this, but what I really want is what's inside you. What actually caused you to give me the food and the stone in the first place?" And I think within each one of us is just that sense of recognizing that we are human beings who need to reach out and to touch and to improve other people's lives. That something within each one of us knows that we have a capacity to be able to reach out and touch other people. And we've experienced that, and you've experienced the joy of being able to reach out and touch people in that way. But also you know how it feels, both when you do that act of kindness, but also when you receive that act of kindness. This series has come about in a very bizarre way. In the politics, philosophy, language and communication studies department, quite a diverse and eclectic mix of people. I had a research away day, and the idea of thinking about how could we bring all these sort of diverse research interests together and to come up with a research project would actually cross some of the disciplines. And so people were asked to think sort of outside the box and what would make a really interesting research project. And what about a dozen or so people end up thinking and concentrating on? There's the idea of compassion, the idea of kindness. And we all had sort of individual stories. Being of a certain age, we have elderly parents who have illnesses and sicknesses. And we could think about how the health service have been able to provide sort of kind acts. And you'll notice sort of a particular nurse or a neighbour or somebody who's actually was particularly kind. And we all sort of approach it from a different angle. As somebody who's interested in politics in particular, I was quite interested from the political angle. And I was interested by this particular guy here.
So I say to you, don't accept injustice. Stand up against prejudice. Let us build a kinder politics, a more caring society together. Let's put our values, the people's values, back into politics. Conference, thank you.
Okay, the subtitling was rubbish, wasn't it? A kinder politics, but the idea of a kinder politics, and this was Corbyn's first speech at a Labour Party conference after his election as party leader. And what he was advocating was a kinder way of sort of looking at the world, a kinder politics. And that was a message which sort of resonates really with every successive leader. And so it's not something which is particular to the Labour Party. Theresa May came out with much the same sort of position on the steps of Downing Street. Tony Blair talked about it. David Cameron talked about it. And we're going to have this new kind of politics. And it lasts for about 2 weeks. And that's it. So it's back to business as usual and the adversarial politics which takes place. We live in a world in which adversarial politics and being unkind, perhaps, comes to the fore. And yet you look at somebody like him and you think, well, actually, you know, his sort of tweets that he produces, his attitude towards different groupings, be it women, be it ethnic minorities, people of different religion. And you think, well, you know, is there any kindness there at all? And yet you actually look into his background and you see a man who has a lot of faults, as we all do, and yet acts of very real kindness being expressed and shown to one another. And what happens in an adversarial politics is that we fail to see the good in others, and we fail to respond to them in a kind way. Now, you know, when you think about political processes, then people have very strong opinions. But what seems to be a recurring theme, or the knowing of people like Corbyn, people like May, people like Cameron, is that they realise that this isn't the way it ought to be. There must be another way of doing it. We live in a world in which adversarial politics, being unpleasant to one another, has become par for the course. Social media, in particular, breeds an environment in which it's possible to talk to people and to express views that we wouldn't dream of expressing face to face. And we can either just accept that as the world in which we live, or we can start to individually take action to try and change that thought processes, or those thought processes. Now, tonight we're going to sort of explore education in particular, and being kind in education. And I'm just the warm-up act for the real deal, who's going to talk about this in just a few minutes. So there's Dr. Laura Biggart, who's a senior lecturer here in the School of Psychology. Done a lot of work on emotional intelligence, emotional well-being, children and offending behaviour, social work as well. And we've got Mary Myatt, who's just launching a book on the national curriculum, which would be very interesting. A noted sort of writer, speaker, somebody who's really engaged with issues around education for a number of years. And so it's going to be interesting to hear what they have to say to us later on. And there'll be an opportunity for question and answers later. In the rest of the series, so next week we're going to move on and look at kindness in the community. And so we've got three particular groups, or representatives of groups, who are going to help us in that process of understanding what it is to be kind within the community. And many of you will be familiar with this particular organisation, the Missing Kind, just outside the castle, where the buses park. You'll see the Kind of Cafe and the Missing Kind. Didn't realise it's actually a 5-storey building. They've got lots of offices, lots of good things which they're doing. One of the things that's really excited me about that, and I'm not going to spoil their thunder and tell you exactly what they do, because they'll talk about this next week, but one thing which I found very interesting was the opportunity to be able to donate meals and drinks to people, and little acts of kindness that you can do without sort of making a big deal and fuss about it, but which make a real difference to people's lives. And so that will be very interesting indeed. We've also got Hanna Rich coming up. She's from the Theos think tank, which is a theological think tank. She'll be talking about the work that Theos have done in terms of the research which they're doing at the moment around social action, particularly regarding churches and their involvement in social action, and how they've been making a real difference right around the country. So that should be very interesting. Then from Belfast, we've got not these two guys, but Sandra Rutherford, who is involved in the Clonard Fitzroy Fellowship. Now, I put the picture up of these two people, Reverend Ken Newell and Father Jerry Reynolds. Father Jerry Reynolds unfortunately passed away last year or the year before. But the Clonard Fitzroy Fellowship has been going for about 20 or 30 years now, and basically involves people from Fitzroy Presbyterian Church, Protestant church near Queen's University, Belfast, and Clonard Monastery in the Falls Road district. Clonard Monastery was the ground really where the IRA decided to give up the armed struggle, largely through the ministry of people like Alex Reid and Jerry Reynolds as well. And what they did throughout the Troubles was actually reach out and touch the other communities, so the Catholic and the Protestant communities. And she's going to talk about that and how that sort of moved on from there to actually look at reaching out as Christian groups, actually reaching out to gay people in Northern Ireland, reaching out to the migrants, reaching out to sort of beyond just this Catholic-Protestant divide. So that should be interesting. And then finally, in 3 weeks' time, we've got Sal Brinton's, who's the president of the Liberal Democrats. And she's coming and talking about being kind in public life. So going back to sort of the idea of the politics, how we can have a kind of politics. And we've got Anthony Isaacs, who does the Sunday programme, is going to be interviewing her. So it'll be in conversation with Anthony Isaacs. It'll also be on the radio as well. And it should be a very interesting session. Okay, so that gives you a sort of a flavour of what we want to talk about in the next 3 weeks or so. As an ardent Republican, I find myself rather shocked at sort of having Princess Diana quote, but I thought it was quite useful. So the idea of random acts of kindness, no expectation of reward. This is what the organisations which I've spoken to you do as a matter of routine. And something where there is a place for that within politics and certainly within the education system. It's an interesting quote. We could have had Luke 6:38. Given it shall be given to you, good measure, pressed down, shaken together and overflowing into your lap. With the same measure that you use, the same measure will be used back to you. And this is something which is standard within many sort of faith traditions. The idea you give, and just for that act of giving, but you actually receive back as well. Anybody know who this is? Nope, no reason why you should, because she's secret. She's a millionaire. And I don't know if any of you remember the Secret Millionaire program on the TV. used to be one of my favourite programmes because you get some millionaire who wanted to give some money away and would go into deprived areas, would find out what sort of activities were going on in the area and then give money to an organisation, to an individual. And in my own kinder moments, I thought, well, maybe you'd better just pay your taxes and then we can have this shared around to everybody. But what was revealed in that wasn't just the kindness of the person who was getting lots of publicity giving money away, but all the individuals that he came across or she came across who are really making a difference, the unsung heroes. It's a bit more recent, so the big build. Again, anybody seen this? Okay, a few of you. I obviously spend too much of my time watching television. I should be doing something more productive, I guess. But the big build's great because they find somebody who's got some awful sort of thing has happened to them. Their whole lives have been transformed by whatever has befallen a family member. And this build team come in and completely transform the house, bungalow, whatever. But the people who they use are all the local tradesmen. So you get hundreds of people just giving up their time, giving up a whole weekend, giving up a whole week of their time as a pure act of kindness because they've been touched by the story of these people. And it's, a very uplifting kind of program. And that's okay, sort of watching these things and getting a lot of enjoyment out of them, a lot of interest out of them. But, it reveals there's a capacity there within each one of us for these acts of kindness. When people talk about kindness, very often they'll sort of give personal anecdotes and the experiences that they've had and how that sort of changed their lives. I feel a little bit uncomfortable doing that, but I want to tell you about a couple of people that I know quite well, my wife and my son. My son has been out in the snow and everything else, has a busy job, a family, and yet he'll give up nights during the week to go out and sort of to take food, to provide sort of sustenance really for homeless people around the city. Very sort of unobtrusive, just an ordinary guy, but been touched to be able to go out and do that. When I sort of walk down the city with my wife, who's a probation officer, she knows many of the people that we'll see on the street, but she would just go off and get them chips or coffee and things like that. And just the sort of the human interaction, rather than just sort of seeing people and just walking past, or just putting some money in a hat. That human interaction just makes so much difference, both to the giver and to the receiver. No act of kindness, no matter how small, is ever wasted. Ooh, bit of controversy now. Okay, so the talks that we had earlier that were planned earlier, fell within the strike period here at the university. And particularly unkind act, which was losing significant amounts of pension, was obviously felt by particularly younger colleagues that this was going to significantly change their terms and conditions. And the reason I've sort of put this up and wanted to speak a little bit about this is just because of the experience that took place on those picket lines over the month or so that the strikes took place. And it was sort of the random acts of kindness that took place as people brought food. Just somebody, if you've been on a picket line for 3 hours or so, and just getting somebody to beat their horn, is quite a good feeling. But just little acts of kindness. But what happens, the danger of having strikes and things like that and getting people together is they just start to talk and they start to think about how they can change things. And within that, there's a whole idea about what is higher education for? What's actually going on? We have an experience within higher education. And UEA is no different to other universities, where we have significant problems in terms of students with mental health issues, staff with mental health issues as well. A sense of sort of disquiet. The consumerisation of higher education that's taken place leads to very sort of instrumental thinking. It's changed fundamentally the relationship between student and lecturer, where people feel an entitlement perhaps to buy their degree. And that leads to a whole kind of sort of different set of relationships and values. And yet, you know, within that, there's the capacity for kindness. You know, students in particular over the strike were particularly kind, celebrating their lecturers and things like that at different sort of events, and us doing the same with students as well. So there's opportunities there, but let's be realistic about it. There are severe problems within higher education, and it's changing very, very rapidly. People feeling it under considerable strain and stress. And the Pro Vice Chancellor for Arts and Humanities said after one of her talks just recently, be kind to one another. And I think we actually have to start to put that into practice. I began by talking about politics. I'm going to close here. We need to be kind to these people. We need to encourage these people, our local MPs, to change the way that politics takes place, to actually be kind to one another. You know, a short time ago, well, a couple of years ago or so now, 2 MPs in neighbouring constituencies, one of them was severely ill, and his neighbouring MP, happened to be from a different party, donated his kidney to his colleague. That's kindness. Didn't make a fuss about it, didn't get loads of publicity over it, just did it, an act of kindness. And we have people who, I believe, came into politics because they really wanted to make a difference and possibly to make a kinder world. And we need to be kind to them and encourage them to be kind to others as well. Dalai Lama said it probably best. If we can go out and sort of think about how we can practically be kind to one another, then in politics, in education, in our lives, then we can make a better and a kinder world. Thank you very much. Great. Now I have Laura. Get rid of that. If you want to use that, you can use that.
So thanks Lee very much for inviting me to speak as part of the Keswick Hall Lecture series. As Lee said, my name's Laura Biggart. I'm a lecturer in psychology and an applied psychologist here in the School of Psychology. And I'm going to talk to you this evening about some research we've been doing on emotional resilience. And the sort of link to the theme, if you like, is really thinking about how we can be kind to ourselves. It's very difficult to be kind to others if we ourselves are not in a kind of emotionally stable state. And we carried out some research with social workers in relation to how do they remain emotionally resilient in their work. We were very interested in how they do that because clearly social work is a very stressful profession. And we thought if we could learn how social workers do it, we could maybe translate this to other stressful occupations as well. And we could learn something about boosting our own emotional resilience, and hopefully you'll go away this evening with a few tips from what we found from our research. So we start from the sort of standpoint that for all of us, whoever we are, life can be pretty overwhelming at times. And life has us on the run quite often. And emotional resilience is really the ability to tap into the resources available to us, not only within ourselves, but also taking advantage of the social support that we get from others. And that helps us bounce back, if you like, from the adversities that we face. So emotional resilience is this bounce back ability, if you like, when we face adversity. When we talk about emotional resilience, particularly when we see it in the press and so on, it tends to be talked about in relation to an individual trait or an individual ability. And sure, that has an aspect to it. We all have biological differences, personality differences, which will make us differentially susceptible to how we react to adversity. However, that's not the only story, even though I'm a psychologist and interested in that. There are other real important influences from the family environment that we grew up in. Was that a loving family environment, a supportive family environment, an encouraging family environment? The society that we live in and that we grew up in, is it a rich or poor society? And of course the neighbourhoods that we live in. All of these will have an impact on how emotionally resilient we can be. And our research was particularly interested in, okay, well, what effect does the work environment have on how emotionally resilient we can be? So we carried out a study for 3 years on, funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. We worked with 8 local authorities in England and over 200 child and family social workers who were very kind to offer their time to participate in our research. And they were working in a whole range of different social work roles, such as foster care, adoption, child protection, looked after children, family centres and children in need. So the 3-year study covered a whole host of areas, but we're going to focus just on the emotional resilience part. And the first question we asked our social workers was, what do you find emotionally demanding at work? One of the key elements of managing our emotions is to know what we find emotionally demanding, so identifying what possible problems could be. So we asked them this, and we mapped their replies, if you like, onto a well-known organisational psychology model called the Job Demands and Resources model. And this is used extensively by the Health and Safety Executive in relation to helping organisations manage stress, based on a great deal of research which has uncovered the most common job demands that people report that are linked to stress. And these are workload, so if you have a lot of work, it can lead to more stress, but also the intensity of the work and the difficulty of the work. So some parameters around workload. Role clarity, so how clear is your role? Do you know what you're meant to be doing? Role conflict, to what extent do you have conflict with other professionals? To what extent do you have conflict with maybe service users? What's your working environment like? Is it really hazardous? Are you exposed to hazards such as physical aggression, for example? Are you exposed to physical hazards as well? And then to what extent are you exposed to change at work? So large organisational reorganisations, that kind of change, and how frequently might you be exposed to that? So these are really commonly well-known job demands, and sure enough, our social workers did talk about all of these areas. A kind of mitigating factor, if you like, is something called job resources. So what factors at work help us mitigate some of these demands, help us deal with some of these demands? And these include job control. How much control do we have over what we do? How much support do we have from supervisors and colleagues? To what extent do we have access to training and development? And how much access do we have to financial or other resources that help us do our work? And those things help mitigate the demands. So over and above that, the social workers told us that these emotional demands were particularly concerning for them. And these were witnessing trauma, having the weight of responsibility for the cases of the children that they were dealing with, concern about verbal and physical aggression. Verbal aggression very frequently, physical aggression less frequently, but the worry about that possibly happening was a concern. Having difficulty engaging with service users. Very often it would be very obvious to social workers what interventions might be needed, but service users would be very resistant at engaging with those interventions, made the social worker's job much harder. They talked about the negative perception of the profession, particularly the vilification of social workers in the media. That meant that other professionals would quite often be hostile to their role, wouldn't really understand what they do, let alone service users as well, and the public in general. So they felt that they were doing a really important job in society, but the people didn't really recognise the importance of it. So they were battling against that perception as well as the demands of the job itself. And then there was a series of concerns around, I have to manage my own emotions and remain professional whilst trying to help service users manage their own emotions. And that concern in the literature is called something called emotional labour. So a job which involves a lot of emotional work, if you like. And then finally, but not least, a constant psychological preoccupation with the work. So there would always be a case or more that would be on social workers' minds. So this made it very difficult for them to switch off when they were at home. So these were the emotional demands over and above the normal job demands that people experience at work. And these have been linked to stress. Stress has a particularly bad press, generally speaking, but this is just a note really to remember that stress is natural. It's a natural response to changes in the environment, so it's going to happen, however much we try and resist it. And it's meant to be an adaptive process. It's a physical response as well as an emotional response, because it's actually preparing the body for action, and I'm sure you'll be familiar with the flight or fight response from a lot of popular literature in this area. But the point I'm trying to make is, and that I think as adults we often forget, is that stress is a particularly physical response, and the importance of that will become obvious a bit later. So we do experience stress. That is going to be natural. We will experience stress, so we should expect to and not beat ourselves up about feeling stressed occasionally. The link between job demands and resources is that if they're broadly balanced, then stress can be manageable on a day-to-day basis. It becomes a problem when there's an imbalance between these two areas. So if demands go up or resources go down, there becomes an imbalance. And then there's a potential for chronic stress. And this is where stress becomes a problem, is if it's ongoing and there's no break in feeling stressed. And we were interested in how do social workers cope with the stresses and demands of their job. So to find this out, we asked them, what strategies do you use to manage your emotions in your work? And they told us about a whole range of what we are calling engaged strategies. So these were strategies that would help them cope with the work in the long term, and a few disengaged strategies. So these would help them in the short term, but wouldn't actually resolve any of the issues. Here's an example of some of the disengaged strategies they told us about. So things like avoiding the problem, head in the sand approach, wishful thinking, hoping the problem will take care of itself, social withdrawal, so withdrawing from normal day-to-day social activities, self-criticism, and distraction. So all of these strategies do work in terms of trying to handle stress, but they tend to be short-term and that they can create other problems. As you could imagine, if you keep having to drink alcohol to resolve your problems, which doesn't actually resolve the problem, so you have to keep drinking the alcohol, you can see where that's going. So self-criticism, again, the sort of negative spirals that people can end up getting into. So they will work, but they're not great in the long term. So the engaged strategies that social workers told us about were planning ahead, reframing, exercise, tackling the problem, social support, and modifying mood. And I'll just talk through these briefly one by one. So they told us, when they were talking about planning ahead, there was all the usual planning, using your diary, time management, that kind of thing. But what they were picking out was, if I've got a difficult situation coming up, I think about how I'm going to feel in the situation and how others might feel in the situation, because it can then help me think about maybe I could change how or where things are going to happen. Maybe I can help manage expectations. If a family was having to go to court for a child to be removed, you cannot get rid of the horribleness of that situation, but you can help prepare the family for what's going to happen in court, who does what role, so that you take some of the anxiety away from that. And just a little example quote from some of the interviews. This particular social worker, when she was concerned about going to meet a client who was particularly aggressive, she would make sure that she wasn't on her own in the office if they were going to come in, or if she was going to visit them at home, she would take someone with her. So just thinking ahead, taking steps to mitigate tricky circumstances. Second strategy we called reframing, and this is around making meaning. We've got this incredible ability to create reality in our heads. We're able to rethink things, and this strategy is what CBT is broadly based on, where if we think about a situation differently, we will then feel differently about it. And there was quite a nice example from a couple of social workers here. So they'd both experienced a client being verbally abusive towards them and making a complaint against them. So this social worker told us the client became very negative and said, "You've not been very helpful, you've not done anything. They were really very abusive about me personally. They were making complaints, and I found that really quite upsetting." And of course, anyone in this situation would find that upsetting. But this social worker took this to heart, took it very personally, and worried about it for quite a long time afterwards. And if we compare it to this social worker, a very similar situation, this social worker said this had happened. So she said, "I remind myself to feel calm and positive, and I give myself a little pep talk. I remind myself about the client's vulnerability, why they're speaking to me that way. You know, like they've got a personality disorder or they've been abused. That's sort of why they're like that. And that gets to helps get my head sorted." So by thinking about the other person, the possible reasons for the behaviour, she was able to sort of detach or get rid of the personal nature of the abusive comments and think about the situation much more differently, became much less hurtful, much less about herself. So rethinking things can be a really powerful way of managing emotions. A third strategy was around exercise, and I'm not necessarily talking about the kind of boot camp type exercise that seems to be promoted nowadays. A walk around the park would be fine as far as this is concerned. So we remember that stress prepares our body sort of physically. If we take exercise, so in relation to stress, it helps us metabolize the stress hormones, the energy that's produced, gets rid of that, and can improve our mood and distract us from anxious thoughts. And social workers certainly talked about using exercise to do that. A fourth strategy was about tackling the problem. You remember at the beginning we asked social workers what they found emotionally demanding at work. Part of that's quite a useful question to ask ourselves because it can help us identify the problem. It's very difficult to tackle a problem if you don't know what the problem is. And once we know what the problem is, another question to ask is, can I actually influence this problem? Because if we can't, then there's not a great deal of point worrying about it much more. But if we can, then you can think about where I can get help to solve the problem. Can I learn new skills to solve the problem? and this social worker talked about wanting to learn as much as possible. She recognised the skills that she did have, but also the gaps where she didn't know what to do. And she wasn't afraid to ask questions. And she would be very happy to ask questions of colleagues, what do you think? And being able to learn from others is a particularly useful strategy to tackle problems and helps us feel less isolated. And this leads into sort of the fifth strategy of seeking social support. So from family, friends, colleagues, a whole range of sources, and the wider network that you have, the more possibility you have of seeking social support. And that serves several functions. It helps provide advice, you get a bit of sympathy and validation for your upsetness, and it can also help you reframe. So these things do link and help each other. It can help us gain another perspective. And then a final strategy was around modifying mood. What did social workers do if they're in the middle of a meeting and feeling pretty rubbish? What could they actually do to try and make themselves feel a bit better? And they talked about bringing to mind people that they loved, the funny things that their pets did that morning, to sort of boost their mood. This is my cat's hard stare. And then they thought about places where they felt relaxed, so maybe a holiday they'd been to. This is in the Broads, this is a swallowtail butterfly. I highly recommend that you go and see one if you're ever in Norfolk. Hickling Broad is the place to catch them. And other social workers talked about using religion, if they were religious. This social worker could go to prayer whenever they liked. Halfway through, you feel totally disconnected, and running to worship really made him replenish, relax, and take a step back to refresh himself. And other techniques such as meditation or mindfulness would achieve a similar thing. So a range of techniques to help modify their mood. Now, this reminds me that I forgot to ask you to think about what strategies you use to manage your emotions earlier. And this was my opportunity to ask you how many of those strategies were engaged strategies. So you may want to reflect maybe later today or through the week. What kind of strategies do you use? What coping strategies do you use? To what extent are they engaged? To what extent are they disengaged strategies? And we're never going to get rid of the disengaged strategies. I myself am very fond of a glass of wine at the end of the day. But we should be sort of aiming to redress the balance to using more engaged strategies and less disengaged strategies. And you can find a postcard with these summarised when you sort of leave this evening of the 6 strategies of planning ahead, reframing, exercise, tackling the problem, seeking support, and modifying mood. Thanks for listening.
Well, is it on? It's very, is that working? Just.
Yep.
It's very good to be here. UEA has a big place in my heart for a number of reasons, but I won't digress by telling you all the reasons now, but just to say a grandchild is part of the story via UEA. Really happy to share with you some of the thinking that I've been doing around hopeful schools and the part that it has to play in the narrative around happiness. Just a bit of background about why I'm here and what I do is that for about 20 years I was working in Suffolk Before then, I'd been in London and Cambridge, but for the most part of my career, I was teaching religious education just outside Ipswich in Suffolk. Then joined the local authority, general school improvement, support pre and post Ofsted, and then also the legal side of religious education for the authority as well. Since then, so for about the last 6 years or so, I've been independent, partly in RE and partly in leadership, ethos, values, and really trying to tease out the good things that are happening in the sector, in the educational sector, because I take the view that we're hardwired to notice the negative, and that we need to override that by consciously reflecting on the things that are going well, both in our own professional practice and that of the colleagues we see. Otherwise, it's a downward spiral of everything just getting worse and worse. So it's been a strong thread of my work, always looking for the positive, because then it puts us in a position to be able to reflect on the things that need improving. So what I do day by day is I work in schools, talking to pupils, teachers and leaders about learning leadership in the curriculum. And in order to clarify my own thoughts, I write them down, I blog about them, and then by magic they get turned into books. The big thread of my work, particularly inspection and advisory, school improvement work, is that we need to be treating our colleagues and our children as human beings first and as professionals second, our learners as human beings first and students and pupils second. And I think we have to make a conscious decision to do this because the systems are tough. The systems are tough. But I make the case that we as individuals can make a difference. One of the problems is that there's so much that needs to be done in the world that we can think it's just too much to tackle. There's nothing I can do about an awful lot of the world's problems, most of them. But I do have some ownership and some work to do in my own little sphere. And I think if we all are cognizant of that, then the world is a better place. So the work that I've been doing up until recently has been about building humane communities, and underpinning that has been talking about more about kindness in schools. And one of the threads of my work is making the implicit explicit. So if I'm thinking something that's positive about another professional, another colleague or a friend, and I neglect to say it, that's a real missed opportunity for actually growing and giving a gift to that person. Similarly, particularly when I'm talking about what works and appears to be having impact in classrooms and improving outcomes, quite often I'm talking with people who are just doing it naturally and they just think everybody does it. And I'm pulling them back and saying, no, there's something important going on here that you're doing naturally, and we need to pull it out and talk about it explicitly so that you can do more of it and you can also talk to others about it. And so, and part of that has been the narrative around building humane communities and the kindness that underpins that. So why then does this matter? I think it matters because we're not talking enough as a sector. I'm talking about the educational sector, schools, primary, infants, secondary, sixth form colleges, that sector. I don't believe we're talking sufficiently about the language of hope and humanity. So when I share this with colleagues, I ask them, don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to do it now, but I will just ask you to look at them. But I ask them to look at that list, their synonyms for humane or humanity, and just ask people to talk about one or two that resonate with them, and then to talk about it either in pairs or slightly larger groups. what's interesting is that people's demeanour and their eyes light up when they start talking and reflecting on this language. And it's so far removed from the language of accountability, of grading, of SATs, of GCSEs and A-levels, and all the everyday narrative of what goes on in terms of accountability within the sector, that it's almost as though it's releasing something in people that say, actually, this is as legitimate to talk about this as it is on those harder metrics. So some of the elements then of building humane communities which are underpinned by kindness in the work that I've been doing are underpinned by these. There's a sense of big-heartedness about certain settings within the sector, a spirit of generosity expressed by everyone within that setting. And it's not to say that they're perfect, but it's this sense of actually everyone here is welcome. Everyone's got something to contribute. And when people are working in that way, it does remarkable things both for the individuals who are operating in that way and in terms of provision and outcomes for young children. The spirit of generosity appears to be there. I also talk a lot, and I'm old enough and have been battered enough to be able to say with a straight face, we need to be talking more about professional love, and I do when I'm talking to my colleagues. It's a big factor in terms of kindness being lived out. So, and particularly for the heads and senior leaders that I'm working with, where they're quite often in a very isolated position where everything ends with them. And I always say to them, when you are with other people in conferences or seminars or whatever, you must find the professional friendships as well as the professional relationships. I've always maintained, and I remember as a newly qualified teacher myself, I was aware of it, that I needed to know that there was one person at least, and I've always felt this wherever I've worked, one person at least who I could talk to without fear or favour of it being misinterpreted or being held against me, in order just to be able to share absolutely honestly what was going on. And I try to do that for other people as well. Because unless we have that kind of space for professional honesty underpinned by love, I think the pressures close in on us. Where this originally came from, actually, in my advisory work, was that I was doing a lot of work with RE subject leaders and coordinators in primary schools, and for the most part, they were single-parent departments, one person doing a huge amount in schools. And so in running the network meetings, I would say, you really mustn't leave unless you've made someone you potentially can be friends with, that you can communicate with. When we've got that in place, magical stuff starts to happen. The other characteristic of hopeful schools that are building humane societies and communities underpinned by kindness is they have the ethic of everybody. The ethic of everybody. There's an expectation that every child, wherever their starting point, is going to be given every possible opportunity and expectation, not everything's going to be done for them, to really achieve marvellous things. And that means the awkward squad as well. The ethic of everybody means that I am available professionally and psychologically and intellectually for every constituent, whether it's pupils, students, their parents, other colleagues, the ethic of everybody. And in my work, when I'm working in schools, supporting school improvement, and formerly when I was inspecting, I would actually test this out and say, does everyone really feel part of this community? I wouldn't say that to them. It would be a form of words along the lines of do your opinions matter? What's it like working here? And so if we mean everyone is going to be supported to succeed, that does mean everyone, including support staff, including lunchtime supervisors, the people who look after premises, everyone. And then everyone gains. And linked to this is the notion of hospitality. My colleague, Catherine Wright, Dr. Catherine Wright, as she is now, just achieved her doctorate through this university, and she and I have done a lot of work together over the years within religious education, but a lot of her work for her doctorate has been around the notion of hospitality. As a teacher, and children are coming into my classroom, is there a sense that you're welcome? That you're welcome here? And again, I'm checking this, I'm no longer in the classroom every day, but I'm checking this when I'm going into schools to see how well visitors are received as they come into the school. Now, I'm the symbol. It's not about me personally, how well I'm received. It's about how is the stranger received and welcomed within this setting, within this context. And where possible, I also hang around a bit to see how children are treated when they go up to reception. And ideally, when some parents come in, what's the response they get from the people who are the first ones to see them? Now, this is not about making judgments about those individuals who are manning the front desk. It's a judgment about the leadership. Because if everyone feels truly valued, if everyone truly counts, and they really know that, they're going to offer that to others. So when I see that it is not happening, then it's not about that individual. It's about what's happening further up that makes them less than generous-spirited with the people who come in. A sense of hospitality. A culture of giving, and this has already been touched on, but actually giving without any expectation of anything in return. And the paradox is, when we enter that space, more comes back to us. And I'm talking increasingly in my work in schools around actually the opportunities for all to give. It's not just a one-way traffic. It's not just from the adults to the children. It's not from the powerful to the less powerful. Are we creating opportunities actually for everyone to give? Because it's a great gift to be able to give. And I'm particularly having conversations around the children who have additional needs, significant additional needs. And when I'm looking with colleagues at their individual educational plans and what the school is going to put in terms of support for those children, I'm quite often saying, well, where are you asking the child what gifts they've got to bring to this? So if we're not careful, then we create a level of dependency which is ultimately very depressing. Okay? And one of the greatest things we can do to someone is say, oh, I wonder if you could help, or what could you do? So this notion, the culture of giving, it's not a one-way traffic. And linked to this, certainly with the ethic of excellence as well, the ethic of everybody, is the notion of learning without limits. Learning without limits. I'm having to watch myself not to become too political about this, but I have grave reservations about ability setting, ability tables in primary, setting by ability in secondary, the consequences of which are putting serious limits on some of our children, because the analysis is out there that if you have additional funding, you're from a poorer background, you're generally on those lower tables or in those lower sets. I would think we've got some tough conversations to have about that. because IQ, however we determine it, is not linked to postcode. So it's a bit of a political jam. I'm not terribly popular for saying that. Very interesting. When I tackle heads about this, they say, yeah, but our parents like it. I say, yeah, right. The ones who are in the bottom groups, silence. I think one day we'll be looking at the way we talk about ability through the same lens as gender and race. I feel really strongly about it. Those settings which are characterised by kindness, those that are building humane communities, they look up and they lift others up. This is a great work being done by Rosabeth Moss-Cantor, one of the world's leading leadership and management gurus. She's American. And she focuses on the absolute basics that are making a difference in the most successful companies. And these are a couple of things that leaders do and they encourage others to do. Really important to look up both psychologically and physically. Sky is fabulous at the moment. The blossom at the moment, just stunning. That fills our souls with the magic and the mystery of the universe. But again, it's overriding our tendency to look not deliberately, but for the negative. And so this is really important, and lifting others up. And I think we need to remind ourselves that we never know the good we do. We never know the good we do. And we'll all have had occasions when someone has come to us and said, the time you did this, or you saw this in me, or you encouraged me, and you've completely forgotten. I bet that's happened to all of you. And so you're filled with surprise and gratitude when that happens. And I'm sure you can think of people who have just said the odd word at the right moment. It's been like a sparrow lifting you up. So what I'm arguing from this is that we have to be so careful what comes out of our mouths, because we are inadvertently building people up or we are crushing them. And linked to this, there's no need to be right all the time. It's not about being precious. And some of the work I'm doing with leaders, and this is actually the paradox of opening up and disclosing some of the things that have gone wrong for us professionally. Obviously not everything, use it judiciously, but paradoxically gives us greater power. Now we don't do it to give us greater power, but there's something really interesting going on, that when people are at a certain level of seniority within a structure, the more they reveal just the headlines of where it's not always been plain sailing for them, the more it encourages others to realise they don't need to be right all the time. And in order to do this important work in our communities, wherever we are, but in my field, in the education sector, we do have to remember to feed the well. And Laura's session has been really, really interesting on the things that are helpful and the things that are less helpful. And when I'm talking about this with colleagues, I say there's absolutely nothing wrong with the Sauvignon, sobbing into the Sauvignon at the end of the day. However, or celebrating the Sauvignon. However, when that becomes a habit, we all know what happens from that. What some of the research is saying around this is that if we can find something that actually moves us into a space where we can't think about the stuff that's worrying us, that's when we refresh and renew. And increasingly the research out of the States is saying it's not a luxury, it's actually essential if we're going to function properly. That feeding of the well is incredibly important. So whatever it is, it's worth reminding ourselves, whether it's bridge, Sudoku, walking, hiking, whatever it is, something that means that we can only focus on that and not the bigger agenda during the day is very, very powerful psychologically and just holistically in any case. There's a paradox of hope, and it is this, that it is not, it's not Pollyanna-ish, it's not looking through the lens of just thinking rose-tinted spectacles. It's actually looking very squarely at the things that are not going well, accepting those and transcending them. And in the work that I'm doing with the leaders that are doing this, they've nailed that. So some things that hopeful leaders do is they themselves, and then do it with their colleagues, they talk about the distance that has been travelled. And this is really important because day by day, it can feel as though not only is not much happening in terms of improvement, but sometimes we're going backwards. Well, that's how stuff happens. That's how improvements are made over time. But when you look at it over a longer stretch of time, by and large, if we're half decent at what we're doing, there have been some improvements. And so this longer lens of actually, well, this is where we are now. There's still more work to do, but this is where we were a year, 18 months or so ago. Very, very powerful in terms of creating hope within communities. Now, being in the black refers to the fact that I'm making the case that as a sector, the educational sector, the school sector, we have a significant balance of goodwill in the bank account of goodwill. We're in the black. All the research says that, but also when you talk to parents, and when I talk, I do a lot of student and pupil voice, particularly with the disaffected, I'm very interested in why it's not working for some children. Interestingly, just the act of asking people why something's not working goes part of the way to solving the problem. It's very interesting. Some big research around that, which I don't have time to go into. But anyway, as a sector, I would argue that we're in the black. Doesn't mean to say we get everything right, get lots of things wrong, for the most part. And so what I'm arguing from this is we draw on some of that being in the black, draw some of that money out so we can have some tough conversations, so that we don't drift into everything being cosy and sweet and nice, and I can't have tough conversations, I don't want to upset anyone. No, I've got sufficient goodwill, and when I know that it's important to critique the work and not the person, then I'm going to be improving stuff. So it's this balance that I'm arguing for, and why then all of this matters, that when it's put together, beyond the educational sector, what the wider research is showing, that these sorts of elements that I've been headlining just now, they're also indicators of healthy organisations beyond the education sector. What they managed to do is to hold a balance between the pay attention to the soft stuff. So those are the things that where there is the ethic of everybody, where there is respect for the individual, where the dignity of humanity is held up. It's not about being soppy. Where that soft stuff is also balanced with the hard metrics. So in business, the hard metrics are how profitable they are, and in our sector, we know what they are in our sector, the public exams. Where they're not held in reasonable balance, it's not sustainable. So the schools that only focus on results are not happy places to learn and to work. Those schools that drift too much into the soft stuff, over-scaffold work for children, make things too easy for those with additional needs, don't put enough cognitive challenge on them, and equally don't have those tough conversations that move the agenda on. So, and in business, those that only focus on the hard metrics, again, are not sustainable. You've only got to look at Ryanair. It's been their trademarks. They've traded on the fact that they have complete contempt for us as clients, and it also turned out for their employees as well. They're having to completely redo their business model. So this notion of humanity and kindness is really important. Then we can say we've got those in balance, that we've got our values that are lived. They're not just laminated. They're not just stuck on a wall. Some of the things that underpin this, noticing. We all crave to be noticed for the unique individual that we are. Some very, very powerful research around that, including Rosebeth Moss-Cantor's work. Expressing gratitude. Huge amounts of work being done on the difference this makes, not just for the person who is expressing the gratitude, but for the people who are on the receiving end of it. Enormous difference. Everyone a voice, which I touched on earlier. Do your views really matter? I'm not going to bring my best work to any setting where I think I'm going to be sneered at or put down. When I'm in the conditions of high challenge and low threat, I am going to bring my best ideas. I am going to be open about the things that go wrong, because I'm not going to be made to feel stupid. So does everyone have a voice? And I do mean everyone. When we've got that in place, we can then say we've created psychologically safe spaces where we can have high challenge, low threat. We can take the truth as long as we've distinguished the work from the person. So we're kind to the person and we're tough on the work. We can then really debate and discuss our practice. When settings have got this right, it's so life-affirming, it's so exciting, where we can have conversations of radical candor, where we can be both robust and kind. And as long as we do all this, we remember that we're human beings first, we're professionals second, that the young people we work with are human beings first, they're learners second. And if you'd like to continue the conversation, that's me on the Twitter. Thank you, colleagues. Oh, okay, thank you. Okay.
Thank you very much indeed, Mary, and Laura as well. Two really terrific talks. We've got about 15 minutes or so for the Q&A session. I have been warned that we've got a dance class apparently in the next with bells on their feet, so don't be alarmed if you.
That'd be making people
Sounds
happy.
fun. We'll go there afterwards.
Feel free to. Who'd like to ask the first question?
I've got a microphone.
Thank you. Just whether we could just briefly explore the two different types of perspective we've had from the talks. Laura was on emotional resilience, talking a lot about how children's social workers manage their job. But I just wonder if we might explore the motivations that they have to do a job well. But also the relationship with the last talk about schools and education, which didn't seem to, from my point of view, touch too much on individual teachers, like with the first talk, we talked about individual social workers. So I wonder if you two might just like to explore the relationship between teachers and social workers and the common ground that they might share.
Actually, as Laura's list is going up of the pressures and stresses for social workers, I think, my goodness, yes, teachers would be saying a lot of that as well. I mean, I think that the growth of individual teachers has a huge amount to do with the quality of leadership in a school. So that tends to be my focus, because I want the growth of everyone. But I think because they're quite tight communities, it's the leadership team and the head in particular who really set the weather. And so you're going to get those same pressures, and a lot of them can be alleviated with sensitive leadership, I would say.
Yes, it's really interesting hearing Mary's talk, actually, because another section of the research findings are around the working environment, so what helps social workers feel emotionally safe, if you like. And we drew out or created a model called developing the team as a secure base, because they talked a lot about how colleagues could help them feel psychologically safe, if you like, but particularly supervisors and managers. So we've developed some training around that for managers and supervisors, and it's very similar to the kinds of things that Mary was talking about.
Isn't the kindest thing you can do in education to make sure that most pupils get the best possible education, raise their aspirations, just, in general, try and, whether they're from a poor background, whether they're from a rich background, just make sure they get the best overall education, and something where, you've got challenges for them and things where they're progressing and learning in life. And you know, I mean, from my own personal experience, I've got nieces and nephews of my own, and I kind of, you know, a lot of young people now spend a heck of a lot of time on social media. And I think in education there needs to be much more about getting them away from social media and getting them to things where the phones are not switched on and they're doing things that are really kind of developing them. Because I personally see that as quite, you know, it can work really well, some of the internet and social media, but other things it can create all sorts of problems these days as well.
I mean, a couple of things on that. So just to pick up your first point about aspiration, regardless of background. One of the narratives I really worry about is that children from poorer backgrounds and their families need to be made aspirational, which for me is completely the wrong way around. They do have aspirations. It's completely misinterpreted in lots of sectors in a very patronising way. What they lack is envisaging the route through, which is partly what, you know, the sector has to do. In terms of the social media, I mean, the problem with that is I think human discourse has had the capacity to be both negative and positive. I mean, notes being passed, horrible notes at the back of the class, you know, when I was in a convent thousands of years ago, was doing the same sort of thing. It's just, it's electrified now, you know, the algorithms are just so huge. So I don't think we get people away from doing things by telling them not to. I think we just make other things available and entice them in. And so all the stuff around Duke of Edinburgh and that kind of thing, and getting them outdoors, is the way to do it. So I don't think we can ban it completely. I know that wasn't what you're suggesting, but yeah. Good question there.
Thank you for an interesting talk, or set of talks, I should say. I was listening to someone on Sky News this morning talking about suicides in universities. And it was in Scotland, I think, and statistics suggest numbers are rising. You talked about people being in dark spaces, and I guess these people are in a particularly dark space. How do you think universities should structure themselves to recognise that, and what can they do about it? How can they help those people? Should they help those people?
Okay, I'll have a go at this. Okay, it's quite a big issue, obviously. I think universities are really reflecting the wider picture. There's kind of 1 in 4 people with mental health issues, part of a bigger conversation about mental health, which seems to be, so I sort of welcome the increasing conversation about mental health, reducing the stigma and so on. But I think what we're finding at university level is students are coming in and they're already incredibly anxious because they've been through the system of continual testing and being told that the tests count and that everything is at stake, their future lives, their jobs, their future incomes, all is at stake on tests and results. So they're very results focused. They are in debt, so that raises the stakes even higher. So they come in needing this degree, and then they become overly obsessed with the outcome of the coursework to the detriment of the other things that universities can offer them as students, as an experience, as a developmental journey, and maybe the particular degree they went in with isn't for them. There are other opportunities to work. So I think it's a very complex picture, but I think this pressure that is created from quite an early age in schools suddenly explodes at university when they are away from their usual support networks.
Mary, do you want to comment on the sixth form experiences of that?
Yes, I think probably this is a very personal thing. I haven't got any statistics to back it up. My hunch is that the stigma that was around not being perfectly happy and perfectly mentally healthy the whole time has been removed, and so it's very healthy that it's being talked about now. However, and so I think because of that, people are disclosing more, which is putting more pressures on diminishing public resources. However, I would argue that it's reasonably constant over time. I think it's just been far more private and very agonizing in the past. And I think anyone who's got any relation who lived through the Second World War, for instance, let alone the First, and the legacy of pain, of bereavement, of grief going down through the generations, I think might have something to say to some of the pressures that people are under now. I'm not minimizing those, I'm just saying I think they have been there in one form or another over generations.
Hi, okay, this might be a bit annoying.
Oh, good.
But I've been interested, I was reading a piece about the idea that in the current, some describe neoliberal kind of climate where there's a real focus on individuals to be responsible for their own lives, their own problems, that there may be a slight colonising or corporatising of ideas like resilience as a way of kind of saying to individuals, you know, you get better at coping with this stuff and then we don't have to deal with the stuff, or to look at the kind of more structural conditions that might lead to increased pressure or stress or resources or whatever. And I just found that quite an interesting idea. I don't know what you think.
Yes, I agree with you. So I think the difficulty with a short talk like this is I normally do it in context of the organisation and in context of teams and what they can do. But that's difficult to cram into 20 minutes. So I agree, it shouldn't be all down to the individual. I agree that's a danger with things like training around emotional resilience, that it gets looked at as being an individual issue. So we have developed training, but we put it into place with the proviso that managers have to take it as well, so that they understand what their responsibilities are and how they can help set the tone, as Mary put it, because it's a holistic, you have to tackle these issues holistically, and no one area is going to solve it as such.
I was kind of also thinking in terms of, in the social work context, families, parents, whatever that sense, if there's this expectation on children,
Yes.
if there's an expectation,
You should be resilient,
you be resilient and then you'll be fine, and we don't have to tackle the fact that public services are stripped out, pensions are going and all this.
Yes, exactly. And our perspective on resilience is much more this psychosocial perspective, where the family, the society, the neighbourhood, the income, they all contribute. It's not just down to the individual. So I think I'm agreeing with you, really.
But I just think it's an interesting argument to be had about some of these concepts.
We've probably got time for one more question. There we go.
I was really interested in the photograph you put up, Lee, of the MPs locally, and you're calling us all to be kind to our MPs. And it made me wonder about the question, why do you think we should be kind to people who may not be kind to others, who may be unkind themselves?
Okay, lovely. So, why should we be kind to MPs? Who else is going to be kind? Well, okay, so I think you get back what you give. And if you see people in a certain way and respond to them in a certain way, very often a predictable way, and seeing politics as being purely combative, then it doesn't give you the capacity to be able to reach out across sort of partisan lines and to reach those MPs at a different level. You know, I'd probably naive, and probably a lot of my politics colleagues would sort of disagree, but I still believe that most people go into public life because they do want to make a difference. And we may have different views about how we get there, but that's the core of what they're hoping to achieve. So I think if you approach people in a slightly different way, Charles Clarke, who was local MP here and was been involved in the school for a number of years, was very adversarial when he was an MP. But working with him over sort of 6 or 7 years after being an MP, it was interesting to see how he tried to reach out across party lines and to engage with people who had been his political foes, and actually find common ground with them. So I think actually being kind to the MPs, to encourage them to be kind to other people, and maybe naive, but I actually think that that is a different way and a different approach. It's far too easy on Twitter and social media just to castigate our opponents. Far better to win them over through kindness. Not convinced, but but it hasn't been tried. You see, you know.
I guess it's more the idea that if someone is behaving in a way that's incredibly unkind,
Yes.
is it kind not to?
Yeah. Sure. I mean, you can critique their actions, but not the individual, and appeal to their better self. We all have a higher self, and I think we can appeal to that better nature. But I think we're probably about out of time. So could you express your appreciation for two great talks by Laura and Mary? Thank you very much.